Ask yourself a question. If you had to make Australia even more hostile to human life, how would you do it? The unexpected answer? Plants. In the late 1700s, early British settlers to eastern Australia imported several species of prickly pear cactus, or opuntia, from the Americas. The initial interest in these cacti was for the making of red dye. The plants themselves don't make the dye, but small bugs which live on the cacti, called cochineal insects or Dactylopius coccus, produce a red stain inside their bodies, which is then used to make the dye, specifically the red dye used by the famous British redcoats. These cacti had the additional benefits of producing nice flowers, edible fruit, requiring little water, and made for good hedgerows to keep cattle and sheep penned in. In a landscape where timber for fencing could be scarce and expensive, dense hedges of cacti seemed an ingenious solution. Hardy, drought-resistant, and nearly impenetrable to livestock, prickly pear appeared to be a perfect botanical tool for the uninhabitable hellscape that is Australia. But then, what first seemed like a beneficial agricultural and garden plant spiraled out of control. In their native range across North and South America, opuntia species coexist with many natural enemies, insects, fungi, and grazing animals that naturally limit their spread. Australia offers no such checks. Free at last from predators and pathogens, the cactus population exploded, spreading like a plague across the land. Their pads broke off easily and took root wherever they fell. Birds and livestock spread their seeds. Floodwaters carried fragments across great distances. The plants had slipped beyond the boundaries of cultivation and into the wild. By the late 1800s, the spread of prickly pear had become catastrophic. The cacti formed dense, towering thickets that could reach several meters in height. These thickets choked out all other vegetation and rendered vast tracts of land useless. Farmers found their land swallowed up, completely impassable. The few water sources around became inaccessible. Fence lines vanished beneath creeping paths. Homes were gradually encircled and had to be abandoned. The invasion was a slow-motion disaster unfolding across millions of acres. Beyond just the economic costs, the ecological consequences were severe. Native grasses were smothered, reducing food availability for herbivores. Biodiversity declined as monocultures of cacti displaced everything. Soil conditions deteriorated where ground cover disappeared and erosion followed. Everything eventually became an impassable cactus forest. The cactus infestation devastated rural communities. By the early 20th century, prickly pear covered more than 24 million hectares, an area the size of the UK. Large swaths of Australia were rendered agriculturally worthless. Farmers abandoned properties they could no longer maintain. The cost of clearing land skyrocketed, and property values plummeted. The government faced mounting pressure to intervene as the crisis escalated into a national emergency. Initial attempts at control relied on mechanical removal. Laborers hacked at cactus stands with axes and picks. Teams uprooted plants by hand or plowed them under with heavy equipment. Fires were set in hopes of burning back the infestation. Resistance was futile. Even small fragments of the plants left in the soil could regenerate. Burning often failed because the fleshy pads were filled with water. Mechanical removal was slow, expensive, and exhausting, and it couldn't keep pace with the rate that the plants grew. Chemical methods of control followed. Arsenic-based compounds and other early herbicides were applied in large quantities. While chemicals could kill individual plants, the sheer scale of infestation made widespread application impractical and costly. Moreover, these substances pose serious risks to health. Chemical warfare against the cactus ground into an expensive and environmentally damaging stalemate. Desperation led Australian scientists and policymakers to consider a radical alternative: biological control. Instead of fighting the cacti with tools and toxins, perhaps its natural enemies could be enlisted. Attention turned to South America, the cactus's homeland, where numerous insects fed exclusively on opuntia. Among these was a small gray moth, Cactoblastis cactorum. In its native environment, the moth's larvae tunnel into the cactus pads, hollowing them out from within. The feeding causes the plants to collapse and rot. Researchers demonstrated that Cactoblastis cactorum was highly specialized, feeding almost exclusively on Opuntia species. In 1926, the first releases of the cactus moth took place. Egg sticks containing rows of neatly arranged eggs were distributed across infested areas. Local landholders participated enthusiastically, placing the eggs on cactus pads and monitoring their progress. It was an unprecedented experiment on a huge scale. The results were dramatic. The eggs hatched into larvae that burrowed into the cactus pads in coordinated groups. Inside, they fed voraciously, reducing thick, fleshy segments to collapsing shells. Infested plants began to wilt and decay. As moth populations grew, their impact multiplied. Over successive seasons, entire stands of prickly pear vanished. The speed and scale of the decline astonished observers. Areas once rendered impassable began to clear. Sunlight returned to soil surfaces, and native grasses and other vegetation re-emerged. Livestock could once again graze lands that had been abandoned for years. What decades of mechanical and chemical effort had failed to accomplish, a small insect achieved within a few years. Farmers reclaimed productive acreage, land values recovered, government expenditure on control measures dropped dramatically. Rural communities that had faced ruin experienced renewed prosperity. The cactus moth had become a symbol of scientific ingenuity and national resilience. Internationally, the success of the cactus moth was celebrated as one of the greatest triumphs of biological control. Scientists around the world cited the Australian case as proof that carefully selected natural enemies could restore ecological balance. While the moth performed as intended in Australia, later accidental introductions into other regions, including parts of the Caribbean and North America, have caused impacts on the native cactus species. The Australian experience underscored both the promise and the risks inherent in moving organisms beyond their native ranges. Back in Australia, prickly pear was never entirely eradicated, but it was reduced to manageable levels. Ongoing monitoring ensures that the surviving patches do not regain dominance. The balance achieved by the cactus moth proved stable over the long term, preventing the invasive plant from reclaiming its former territory. Today, the eradication of prickly pear in Australia stands as a landmark event in environmental management. It began with a well-intentioned introduction, escalated into one of the worst botanical invasions in history, and concluded with the pioneering of the field of biological control.